Okay, the next item on our agenda is a special presentation regarding the projected cost of Jackson County for possible implementation of the local measure 15-119 GMO ban by Danny. I want to prelude this presentation that this is neither a presentation to be in favor of or against this particular ballot measure. Danny will present facts. He was asked by the board to come up with these so we'd have some idea if in fact this ballot measure is approved and what kind of financial consequences, if any, that Jackson County might have. So this is strictly neutral, and that's the way the presentation. We've gone through all the legal things to make sure that we are in compliance with that, and then philosophically with the three of us at this, we just asked for the facts. So people, please bear this in mind. So with that, Mr. Jordan, you're on.
Mr. Chair, Board of Commissioners, thank you for allowing me to present to you today. I want to start, first of all, by saying that this is meant to just present the facts, but there are a ton of variables related to those facts. And I want to start off before I actually go into the PowerPoint presentation by saying the ordinance essentially makes it a county violation for any purpose for any person or entity to propagate, cultivate, raise, or grow genetically engineered plants within Jackson County. And the board asked me to try to compute should the county enforce the ordinance as it's presented to the voters with estimates of costs of doing that. That one sentence seems fairly simple, really. The difficulty in preparing for you what it would cost to implement that really is driven, in my mind, by the next thing that I'm going to read for you, which is the definition of what genetically engineered plants are. And that's in the ordinance as well. So I'd like to read that real quickly. This is going to point out how much expertise I lack about the issue. And hopefully people that are in the room that probably may pronounce these terms a little bit better than me will forgive my lack of vocabulary with regard to the issue. But for purposes of this ordinance, genetically engineered shall be interpreted by the following definitions. One, quote, genetically engineered, end quote, means modification of living plants and organisms by genetic engineering, altering or amending DNA using recombinant DNA technology, such as gene deletion, gene doubling, introducing a foreign gene or changing the position of genes, and includes cell fusion, parentheses, including protoplast fusion, parentheses, microencapsulation, macroencapsulation, gene splicing, parentheses, or hybridization techniques that overcome the natural, physiological, reproductive, or recombination barriers where the donor cells / protoplast do not fall within the same taxonomic family in a way that does not occur by natural multiplication or natural recombination, quote, in vitro nucleic acid techniques, end quote, include but are not limited to recombinant DNA or RNA techniques that use vector systems and techniques involving direct induction into the organisms of hereditary materials prepared outside the organisms, such as microinjection, macroinjection, chemoporation, electroporation, microencapsulation, and liposome fusion, and any other technology or technique that results in an organism that contains genes from more than one species or genes that are not naturally occurring. Quote, genetically engineered, end quote, does not include traditional selective breeding, conjugation, fermentation, hybridization, or normal in vitro fertilization. The reason why I read that to you is before you asked me to look at this, I would say about 90% of that, I had no clue what it meant. After looking at it, I would say about 70% of that, I still have very limited knowledge about what it means. In order to compute what implementing and enforcing this ordinance would mean should the county choose to do that, it really takes a lot of information about how all of those things impact what happens here locally in our county. The ordinance does speak to the term plants and crops being interchangeable in the ordinance, so this is not just with relation to crops, traditional crops that people may have discussed. It's also with relation to plants. So in order to prepare this for you today, I wanted to go over with you some of the steps that I took to familiarize myself with some of these terms. And I have several staff here today that have helped me put together the information for this presentation to you, but we did consult with an independent contractor from Corvallis. His name is Hal Lewis. He is with Precision Agricultural Resource. He's a breeding and genetics specialist. We actually referred to him by OSU Extension. We did also talk with OSU Extension. We consulted with Iowa State. Our County Roads Department Director, John Vile, was involved in helping me prepare costs. Kelly Matting, who would be over the code enforcement program as well as the Development Services Department, assisted me. Deputy County Administrator Harvey Bragg, former County Counsel Rick Whitlock, and current Interim County Counsel Jill Benton. And I will say that 2 days ago, I think when it was published that I'd be doing this presentation, I was contacted by also Brian Combs, who provided me some factual information, some of which I will discuss, some of which weren't necessarily germane to computing the costs rather than to other issues regarding the election. In addition to that, I was able to find financial impact considerations for other counties that have had considerations of similar. I say similar because almost none of the initiatives in other counties are exactly the same as this one, but they contain similar information. But I did consult the June 30th, 2004 report from Butte County, GMO Initiative Staff Report, the March 1st of 2005 report from Sonoma County, GMO Initiative Petition, and also what appears to be the 2004 report from San Luis Obispo County. Also had some reference to Marin and Mendocino County as well. So that's basically and also let me say I did consult various horticulturalists and different people that are involved. I'm certain that both sides of the argument will say that I should have consulted other people. Frankly, what I'm going to present here to you today certainly will be information that is likely arguable. So let me just say that right off the bat. I do not believe I'm the expert in the science of this. It's my job to really tell you what it would cost should the county choose to enforce it. So as I said, purpose today is to provide you the projected costs to the county. This is not the indirect benefit or consequences to the county citizens. This is the actual hard cost to the county as an organization should the board choose to implement and enforce the ordinance if it were to pass. I will tell you that it does present some significant enforcement challenges, and I'm going to go through some of those as we go. I'm going to qualify this presentation over and over again. And in this case, I do want to say, obviously, cost projections and estimation in this case have multiple enforcement factors. Those are, as I present here, cost variables, frequency of enforcement actions, difficulty of interpreting and defending the ordinance. These do represent me and my staff's best effort to date. I could tell you that I could probably still study this for a year and present additional changes and information and input into it. But given the information we have, the people we've consulted, and the timing of the presentation today, it's essentially as accurate as we believe it can possibly be. The last point here says it all. Because of the significant and complex estimation variables, I cannot assure the ultimate accuracy of the cost projections, so I want to be forthright with that. You said this, Mr. Chair, but essentially the presentation is not intended to promote approval or rejection of the GMO measure. Staff are not urging voters to vote in any particular matter. I will say this presentation was presented to the state election staff, Secretary of State's office, and it has been found by them to not be promoting or opposing the GMO measure and is in compliance with ORS 26432. The advice reference and the approval for that is 14-026 if anybody in our community chooses to verify that. So there's a lot of assumptions and variables. As I read the definition, we've heard a lot from people. You've heard a lot in meetings. I've heard, in fact, Mr. Combs, when he called me, mentioned specifically variable companies that produce seeds as a variable of enforcement. But there's a lot of other variables that I had to consider when determining what this would cost the county. So here's a couple of things, and I'll point some of these out in the ordinance. I won't point all of these out in the ordinance, but essentially our efforts to compute a cost are complicated due to undefined terms and vague terminology used within the proposed ordinance. I'll show you what some of those examples are. So in order to enforce the proposed ordinance, the county's going to have to make some policy and legal judgment on various terms that are not defined. That does increase our risk of litigation. Before I move on past this, I was asked by Mr. Combs and presented information about the likelihood of whether or not the county would be involved in litigation regarding the ordinance. My presentation does not contemplate the county defending the legality of the ordinance or not. That is not a consideration in cost that I made. My understanding is that the county's not taking a position whether you would choose to defend or not defend any legal challenges. You're not required to. If that were the case, obviously, if we went through circuit court and state court, we could be talking state court and federal court, we could be talking of hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal expenses. I say that just to qualify. That is not included in what I'm presenting here to you today. The first example that I want to talk about that creates some complexity is Section 635.10 says jurisdiction, the circuit court of the state shall have jurisdiction for all violation of this ordinance, yet in 635.20 says the abatement procedure may be pursued as an alternative to judicial remedies for a violation of any provision. This is essentially a direct conflict, once again requiring legal judgment. In order to compute a cost, then I have to assume which part of that we pursue in terms of enforcement. As I said, the statements are contradictory. In this case, it would be essentially up to the Development Services Director with the assistance of County Counsel to determine the meaning of the terms and to develop a specific enforcement procedure that's different than code enforcement's current procedures, because that is not what code enforcement currently does, and that will be difficult and costly. As a second example, it purports to exempt educational or scientific institutes, for example, OSU Extension, provided the activities are conducted under secure, enclosed indoor laboratory conditions with the utmost precautions. And I underline and I italic that because utmost precautions is not defined. It doesn't have a legal definition. What does it require? In other words, while I believe the intention is to create a safe harbor, it doesn't necessarily create a safe harbor. So if we're enforcing at OSU Extension because someone alleges they didn't use the, for example, latest technology to protect the environment, or a negative pressure system, which they may or may not use, or any kind of certain thing that someone could constitute would be an utmost precaution, it does put at risk OSU in terms of a potential enforcement action, which is difficult for me to define because we have yet to define what utmost precautions means. For the purpose of this presentation and computing cost, it may or may not be the intention that the ordinance cover all cities within the jurisdiction of the geographic boundaries of Jackson County. However, the Code Enforcement Division of Jackson County currently has no jurisdiction within incorporated cities. So while it would be a countywide program, and I have discussed this with County Counsel. County Counsel's opinion is that the county, based on our police powers, would have no ability to enforce the ordinance within the city limits. Now, that could be argued, according to County Counsel, but County Counsel leans towards the side that in the case of this ordinance And for purposes of preparing this cost estimate, this is what I considered: the county will not enforce the ordinance within city limits because we do not have the authority to do so. In other words, there may be a ban within the cities, but not a way to enforce it in terms of the county's police powers. So I did not compute the cost of doing that. If there were a legal argument made, and if that legal argument prevailed that the county could enforce, this could triple, quadruple the cost estimates that I'm going to present to you, because obviously the cities create a whole nother standard of level of service that we currently don't provide. The fact that this would be an exception to that could create, obviously, issues for violations within city limits, where the county would only enforce this but also does not enforce any other code issues within city limits. So currently, the Code Enforcement Division for the county, for the most part, is capable of enforcing our codified ordinances. Those that are similar in nature are with regard to solid waste, things like abandoned vehicles, also code with illegal construction. And we can do that without the assistance of outside agencies or utilizing independent contractors. That will not be the case for implementation of enforcement of this ordinance. And the reason why is essentially, if you go back to my reading of the definition, we do not have staff on site employed with the county that have the basis of knowledge to make those types of determinations. It will require assistance carrying out the following tasks specifically. It's not limited to these, but identification of testing. So we were informed through our contact with Mr. Lewis, as well as Oregon State, that currently there is no place in Oregon that tests for the genetic modification of plants. With regard to abatement, this is taken out of the ordinance itself, but Section 635.11 sub I requires the county to ensure that the abatement of genetically engineered plants is done with a manner that will minimize genetic contamination or other harm. The county will need to use an independent contractor to determine what that means. And in conversations with Mr. Lewis, there are a whole lot of factors to determine what kind of abatement will minimize harm. Essentially, we're talking about crops and plants that vary with growth cycles. They vary with their capacities for germination. They vary with their capacities for root development, so on and so forth, as well as the type of crop, the time of the year that the violation is noticed. There's just a lot of things that go into determining what would need to be done to minimize contamination and other harm. As I said before, identification of utmost measures. We certainly would need expert witnesses for testimony. As I said, the ordinance contemplates circuit court matters as well as hearings officer proceedings. We don't have people that can testify as experts to the genetic engineering or modification of plants. And certainly this will require utilizing county counsel more frequently than code enforcement does now. Abatement costs. Currently, the county does not have an abatement program. This is due in part to a lack of funding. Abatement is likely to be very expensive. There is no funding and development services budget to pay for it. And another contradiction with our current code is appeals of notices of abatement may also be given to anyone the hearings officer determines to be interested. Currently, our hearings officer does not make a decision on who receives notices. This step will add costs because there'll be a process by which they have to go to do that, and also require us to provide mailings. It adds its liability, and honestly, procedurally, it's awkward for us to do that. There are some other issues that I want to talk about real quick. And this goes back to the broad definition. My conversations with Mr. Combs, he was fairly focused on certain seed production and our ability to do that. But the definition is more broad than that. And in my conversations with all of those various people that I told you we worked with, it covers much wider territory. And I'm going to speak specifically to the issue of gene doubling right now. As I said, I'm not an expert in this. This is information that was provided to me. But I'm going to read to you what I was told, that gene doubling refers to the doubling of a region of DNA that contains a gene, and one of sources of gene duplication is polyploidy, which describes the situation in which an organism has more than the normal two paired sets of chromosomes. One set's from a female and one set's from a male. This can occur naturally. So I think that there is some basis in the ordinance that if it occurs naturally, it wouldn't necessarily constitute being genetically engineered. However, it also can be induced by the introduction of various herbicides and plant hormones. And according to the ordinance, the introduction of those could constitute genetically engineering the plant and gene doubling. This type of process is actually very common in ornamentals. Things like hostas and daylilies are examples. There's something called a tetraploid plant where in those cases they have 2 times the normal number of chromosomes, which means 2 times the number of genes, and therefore gene doubled. There are plants you'll find at nurseries that have these, find plants at flower shops that have these, and Home Depot and Lowe's. For purposes of determining enforcement, this could go pretty far. Frankly, I got to a point where I don't know where you stop before it sounds like, you're picking it apart, but I'm not picking it apart. I'm trying to determine what actions the county would need to take to ensure that we actually meet the requirements of the ordinance. In this case, some of those plants, probably the most mass commercialized marketed plant, my mind just went blank here, I'm sorry. There's a lot working in here right now. Carnations. So carnations is an example of that. Not all carnations have been induced to gene doubling, but there's a good portion that are actually marketed and commercialized. There are other plants like turf grass, roses, orchids, chrysanthemums that are in development. They are being tested. We don't know which of those are being tested here at our local stores that we would have to enforce on or not. There's testing that has to be done to determine whether or not they've actually had their genes doubled. So that's some examples of where gene doubling affects our ability to enforce that doesn't necessarily have to do with going out and abating a crop. There are other examples. This is one that I found where it's actually happened already. Medical marijuana could be impacted by this. There's essentially a primitive form of gene doubling where a substance called colchicine, which is essentially a carcinogen, is introduced to seeds to cause them to double their genes, and it produces a much higher level of THC. I've consulted with our local police agencies, it is a method that is used to increase the amount of THC in marijuana. A lot of medical marijuana growers like to be the producers of the highest THC level marijuana. There's this manner of doing that, but there's also other manners of doing that, some of which could be impacted by the bill. In this case, Hawaii has a GMO ban, and due to the anti-GMO legislation that was enacted there, they were forced to outlaw this type of production of marijuana. So could we find ourselves going to medical marijuana grows and confiscating medical marijuana or marijuana that has had this carcinogenic derivative introduced to it that can double or even quadruple the DNA, which is, by the definition of the ordinance, gene doubling? The answer is yes, we could. And we can't just show up on the scene and look at a marijuana plant and know that that's happened or not. It does require testing. Another thing that's in testing, I talked about turf grass, Scott's Miracle-Gro, genetically modified grass seed. Now they have modified it to protect it from being killed by Roundup. Technically this would be not legal by the ordinance. So there are a lot of other examples of things like this. People may argue that no, I'm wrong about this because of this, or no, I'm right about this because of this. But these are all things will be consequenced with when we're forced to enforce it. We may go out and find out that no, none of this has gene doubling, or we may go out and find out that yes, a lot of it has gene doubling. Determining how much of that will occur, determining whether or not we're going to have to show up at Lowe's or Home Depot or flower shops and tell people that the plants, certain plants, that ornamentals they may have, may not be legal to have in our county, certainly could cost us money. I really couldn't put a number specifically on what that would be to enforce or abate those types of things as simply as I could with crops, which I'll get into. But it certainly is one of those issues that make determining what the cost could be, once again, highly variable. I'm going to go back. This actually was printed in the Hawaii Free Press on December 8th of 2013, so this is a recent issue. And then the Columbus Dispatch on January 31st of 2014 published this. As I said, kind of if you do a search about products that have been gene doubling, you'll have a whole bunch of things that come up. And whether or not they're actually commercialized yet or just in testing phases are also variables in it. So with that said, how I broke out how we would cost this in terms of implementing in the county, I broke out the hard cost within the department separate from the potential for abatement. So I want to talk about the hard cost to the county in the department of enforcing it. And you, of course, could argue the points and the reasons why I costed it this way, but this is in consultation with the staff that actually have to implement it, mostly Ms. Madding, Mr. Zook, who is the supervisor for code enforcement in the county. So notice I put year one. Obviously, if there are these things that exist and an ordinance pass, there likely will be some kind of rush to enforce it or ask for enforcement to be made. The program costs in year one could be significantly more than other years, or they could be significantly less than other years. It depends on how many things really that we're encountered with enforcing. In this case, we included the cost of election. That's up to the board whether or not you actually assign that cost, charge it out to the program. Typically you do, but whether it's a cost to the program or not, it will be a cost that the county will have. And then the program cost. So we have one code enforcement officer. People may say, well, you don't need a code enforcement officer. You already have code enforcement officers. We currently have 2 code enforcement officers that cover 2,800 square miles for all of our ordinances. They are not capable of currently enforcing all of the requirements in code enforcement, and there's no way that adding an additional layer of complexity that's new to them, that requires a lot of education and procedural setup, can be done without additional staff help. We have a tenth of an office assistant to support that person. Obviously, they'll need a vehicle because they'll be going around the county. Direct materials and services, things that they would need to support their work in the field and in the office. Travel and training, that's probably low, especially for the first year, because they're going to need to be trained as much as possible in what those definitions were that I read to you and how they might apply. For the hearings officer contract for testing witnesses, I assumed only 3 cases in the first year that would go to that. Maybe we'll have none. If we have none, you could subtract out the cost of the hearings officer and at least the portion for witness testimony. We still will have the need for doing testing depending on which type of prohibition we're talking about. There are, in some instances, other ways to verify it besides actually contracting for a test. But they're more indirect. And then county overhead and then departmental overhead. So total program cost of $232,000. One thing that I want to say is, with regard to code enforcement, a lot of the public frequently makes comments that, it's all about making money for the county. Our code enforcement division has about 5% of its budget that is supported by fines. So the county is not by any means making money off of people by imposing fines. The total proportion of the department's budget that is attributable to fines is 0.8%. So less than 1% of the revenues that operate the department come from fines. But we do believe that the hearings officer would impose some fines if we actually go through those cases. As I said, if we don't go through the cases, if they don't go through the hearings process, then you can remove the cost for hearings officer and witness, but you can also remove the hearings officer's imposed fines and fees. So the total projected first-year cost, $259,302. Now, I did this projection prior to having access to the 3 reports I talked to you about, the one from Butte County, Sonoma County, and San Luis Obispo. Once I did this and was privy to those reports, I felt fairly comfortable in this because those reports, albeit 10 years older than these cost projections, all are in the ballpark of their estimate of what the costs would be. Now, I don't have actuals of what their costs would be because, honestly, I didn't have time to call and verify with each one of those people. I went off of their report to their governing bodies, and we're in the ballpark. So I feel fairly confident about this number, at least in the first year, giving all of those variables that I talked about and things that we're going to have to learn to understand. Certainly, the definition provides opportunity for other things that I wouldn't even know or wouldn't even know to think about, that some people may have not even thought about or intended, but they could be consequential from the ordinance itself, and we may find new things out that we're forced to enforce. We also may have everyone just decide they're going to abide by the ordinance, and we may go through a year of cost and go, we don't have any problems with this, so we don't have to pay for anything anymore. That is a wide range, I know, but I wanted to be pretty specific about the variables that went into it. Do you have any questions about this part before I move on to the more complicated part of costing this?
Gentlemen?
Danny, I have just a quick one here. I made a note of it. Do you anticipate that enforcement would be complaint-driven? Is that how, I mean, the enforcement officer wouldn't be cruising the county, it would be complaint-driven, similar to code enforcement now?
Well, the ordinance actually speaks to when we're made aware of a violation. There's a process that begins. However, that's really a policy decision. The ordinance doesn't say that we have to have staff out there driving around looking for this stuff, but it also doesn't say we won't do that. So that's more of a policy issue for who the governing body is and the decision you make under your discretion about enforcement.
Okay, thank you.
Falls under discretionary immunity for the governing body. Those things that you all have as the governing body that I don't have as the county administrator. So those are the variables. Any other?
Did you have anything?
I'm still taking this a lot to digest at the moment.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, I want to go into abatement costs now, and this is going to provide a wide range of possibilities. As I said, there could be no cost if people just determined that they're going to comply and they would meet all of the requirements of what they would have to do in terms of the abatement. There will be in terms of enforcement because we're supposed to specify what is required in an abatement. Be able to do that, we're going to have to consult experts to do that. We don't have staff that are experts in that. I did have quite a bit of information we received through Mr. Lewis, who I mentioned is from Precision Agricultural Research and a specialist in breeding and genetics. So I'm going to reference a lot of that since that person obviously knows more than I or my staff know about the issue. So let's see. Let me start here. I mentioned this previously, but essentially at the point the county determines a violation has occurred and an appeal process has remedied, the county shall thereafter take all action necessary to ensure genetically engineered plants are destroyed or removed from within Jackson County in a manner that will minimize genetic contamination or other harm. Minimize genetic contamination is pretty broad. People's subjectivity around what that means could vary tremendously depending on what side of the argument you're on, if you're on a side of the argument. While in the ordinance this cost is assumed to be borne by the violator, in the case of the Jackson County ordinance, the Development Services Department initially shall be responsible to pay for the cost of abatement. So if we choose, ultimately after the processes that are required to abate, the ordinance says specifically that the county shall be responsible. Shall is not a word that gives you the option. The options come before you decide you get here, but once you get here, then we do bear the cost. It does say that the Board of Commissioners may make the cost of special assessment against the property involved or a personal obligation of the generator. I'm going to talk a lot about this right now because this is certainly a consideration that weighs heavily on our ability to fund an abatement should we choose to pursue an abatement. It does not appear to give the county a first priority lien and does not appear to authorize a tax on the property. So the first thing that I want to say about this is with regard to a conversation I had with Mr. Combs where he indicated to me that in terms of the cost recovery for abatement, he took the wording directly out of the county ordinance for solid waste. And that is true. He did take the wording directly out of the county's ordinance for solid waste. However, and I'm going to specifically cite items under recovery of cost of abatement, section 635.23, items J through items M, which he did take directly out of our ordinance for solid waste, are not legal. They are illegal. Our county solid waste ordinance is not legal with regard to those specific issues. Now let me explain that. When the county passes an ordinance, what the county says is this ordinance is being passed. However, that in the case of a conflict with state law will prevail. When the county ordinance was passed, it was in May of 1993, so 21 years ago. In October of 1993, the state saw some pretty significant tax reforms, commonly referred to as Measure 47 and 50, ultimately Measure 50. Changed a lot about what we can do with property liens and tax and how we collect, so on and so forth. In this case, that change in law made that portion of our ordinance not legal. But what is legal is that we then comply with state law. And that's what we've been doing. The county has not utilized an abatement process, as I said a few minutes ago, because we don't have funding to abate. But should we choose to abate, this is not a means by which we can recover funds. And there are specific ORSs related to that. I will say that I did talk to the Department of Revenue, Greg Kramer from the Department of Revenue, who verified that it's illegal, and I also spoke with County Counsel, who verified that it's illegal. Essentially, the specific ORSs that apply are ORS 310-143, 311-255, and 311-505. I can read all of those to you and go through that. I'm hoping that you'll take my word that what I'm telling you is accurate, and you can read it and ask me questions if you want later. The reason why I cite them is for any member of the public that may want to challenge that. They can certainly investigate those statutes themselves. So the county does not have the ability to collect by a lien. The other part of this presentation with regard to the lien, if we were able to do a lien, we wouldn't be a first priority lien because we wouldn't be a tax. In other words, we'd be in line with anything else, a mortgage or a credit line or whatever. So not necessarily would be able to collect. In terms of making it a personal obligation, that is an option. That portion of our solid waste ordinance is legal, and it doesn't tie it to taxes. However, the issue with making something a personal obligation by the board doesn't create an infinite ability to collect that obligation because the Board of Commissioners can't make something a civil judgment. Only the circuit court can docket something as a civil judgment. And a civil judgment is essentially the only thing that would survive a process of discharging, credit, bankruptcy, for example. So I would say that while we have a mechanism for making a personal obligation, we don't necessarily have a mechanism for collecting against that personal obligation that would provide me any level of certainty that the money we would spend to abate would be recovered. With that said, I'm going to go into how I determine the abatement costs. There are some things I want to point out before I get there, though. This is from the ordinance itself. You'll notice there are things that are in italics. The reason why they're in italics is because they're non-defined. They're not clear. Someone may have meant something by what they wrote, but there's not necessarily a legal definition in terms of implementing the ordinance that's tied to these. So this does allow for recovery of all administrative and abatement costs if violators are knowingly and willingly responsible for the violation. That obviously creates a problem for us. We have a lot of people who grow crops that lease property a lot of people that grow crops who may have hired someone to run their business, so they may or may not know. I do know one thing for sure. The ordinance does say if they didn't do it knowingly and willingly, then they're not responsible for it. So I know for certain that if the county were to abate one of those instances, the county is stuck with the cost. There is no recovery because the person didn't knowingly and willingly do it. So we certainly would have a cost that certainly is not recoverable in that case. And as I said, with regard to making something a personal obligation, there's a process that can be expensive. It's not necessarily easy, and there's no guarantee the violator will pay. So this is where I want to get into some of the mathematics of this, and this is where, honestly, my mind was kind of blown about this issue. And Mr. Lewis indicated to me that there's multiple ways by which, as well as actually the Sonoma County report, multiple ways by which abatement can be required depending on the GMO traits. So there's this whole variable issue again. But essentially, I talked to our county assessor because I want to know, what is farmland worth? If we are going to lien something or make it a personal obligation, what's its value? So according to the Jackson County assessor, large farms with very good farmland have a real market value of about $1,000 an acre. Farmland with average soil is about $500 an acre. This is the highest and best use, and we're mostly talking about areas outside the urban growth boundary. So they're not subject for future development, which makes them less valuable in terms of sale value. I will say that after I talked with the assessor and after I presented the presentation, the assessor did come back and tell me that is the value. However, if there are also irrigation on the farmland, then that can increase the value somewhere between $500 and $1,000 per acre. So you're talking about $1,000 to $2,000, maybe $2,500 an acre that the farmland is worth. Non-farm rural land, and I picked RR5 because that is a zoning in the county. It actually has a higher real market value because it provides for development, essentially, is why. And it can have a value of around $20,000 an acre. We're likely not talking about the crops issue being on RR5. It's going to be more probably essentially farmland outside the urban growth boundary. It's not zoned this. However, because it is a possibility, I wanted to include also the higher value. I'm giving all of the information. And then examples of developable land within the city limits. And as I said before, the county, certainly county council's position is the county doesn't have the authority to enforce, but $40,000 to $50,000 an acre in Medford and $80,000 and up an acre in Ashland, they're not going to be relevant to what I'm telling you because the county won't enforce. In other words, we wouldn't abate within the city limits and we wouldn't enforce the ordinance within the city limits. So this is the part that got kind of tough. When I talked, or information from Mr. Lewis indicated that in some cases that you could have a complete, it could be necessary to have a complete soil removal. I mean, the fact is a plant that you pull out of the ground has roots that were under the ground. And just because you pull the plant out doesn't mean there's not remnants of those roots and plant material in the dirt. Also, seeds carry and transfer across the dirt. If there's irrigation, they can also carry via the irrigation means. And so there are certain instances, I don't know all of those instances, that will require complete soil replacement. These were, and I put these up here. I'm going to actually put the count, at least discuss with you the number. I actually had Mr. Weil go out and secure cost estimates for the county because this was a 2005 report. And frankly, when I looked at the number, I just was kind of astonished that it could really cost that much. So I wanted to make sure that that was actually accurate. But essentially in Sonoma County, the California Agricultural Commission estimated cost to remove, dispose, and replace the soil of 1 acre of contaminated GMO would be approximately $86,915. That's per acre. Now, this range of treatments that I talked about, depending on the GMO traits, can include other treatments to minimize contamination and other harm. Chemical soil fumigation and heat treatments, those can cost around $15,000 an acre. So we have land that's worth $1,000 to $2,000 an acre, maybe $20,000 an acre if you have rural RR5. but you have abatement costs that can run $15,000 to $86,000 an acre. This was from 2005, the Sonoma County Agricultural Commission. We actually went out and did get costs. There's any of these that could be required for an abatement, or all of them that could be required for an abatement, or none of them that could be required for an abatement. But assuming that it is required, to clear and grub, this is the step where you take a bulldozer, you cut and push the soil into windrows. Per acre, it's $2,500. To haul it off, it's 1 acre is 43,560 square feet per acre of soil. That's at a depth of 6 inches. So this can also vary. It depends on the traits of the plant, how deep the roots go, how shallow they go. It could be more, it could be less. Essentially, if you had to go from 6 inches to 12 inches, you could double the cost. If you have to go from 6 inches to 3 inches, you can cut the cost in half. And that's not an exact translation, that's an approximate. But essentially, you're talking 972 cubic yards per acre. It's $95 an hour for a 20 cubic yard truck. That's what we typically call a super dump with a driver. It's 1.5 mile for a 40-mile round trip. So this is assuming a midpoint in the valley and hauling to the Dry Creek landfill. You can't take contaminated GMO dirt and just dump it anywhere. It's to be secured. 49 trips at 1.5 hours would be $7,030 to move all of that. Where it gets expensive is the dump fee. It's $68 per cubic yard, so 972 cubic yards to dump. That's 1 acre is $66,096. Topsoil is $30 per cubic yard. That's an average retail cost of topsoil. We would have some cost savings by buying bulk, obviously, depending on how much acreage we're talking about, but that's $26,730. Delivering the topsoil for replacement, $6,460. Spreading the soil, 1 acre, $2,000 an acre. So I'm going to now summarize those numbers. If we just cleared and hauled off the contaminated soil, it's $75,626. If we replace the topsoil, that's per acre. If we replace the topsoil, it's $35,190. So if we remove, clear and haul off, and then replace it, it's a total cost per acre of $110,816 per acre. Remember, with a value of $1,000 to $2,000 per acre. So even if we could lean it and we could foreclose, we certainly would not recover the costs if the remediation were to replace the soil. And as I said, Mr. Lewis did indicate that in some cases, depending on the GMO traits, that is the required abatement process. So that's the very high end of the scale, in my opinion, for what could happen. The very low end is we don't have any of those costs. The owner would choose to spend all that money themselves and go out and do it themselves to comply with the ordinance. And that would be an individual cost, not a cost to the county.
Mr. Chair, could I ask Danny a question?
No.
Sure.
Yeah, before you move on. Danny, the way I'm seeing this, if a landowner goes out, a piece of property is for sale, 5 acres, a new landowner goes out and buys that, and it does have GMO crops on it, that landowner is not aware of, does this go back to that he's not aware of it, it all falls to the county then?
Well, now, I have owned a property management company. I think there would be a disclosure requirement if you had knowingly had something on your
Oh, I
property
see.
that's illegal. So I would assume that it would be a requirement for disclosure, and I would assume that the purchaser would have recourse if it weren't disclosed and it was known to the seller, blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
So, this was an example from Sonoma County. I'm going to carry out the example from Sonoma County. What I'm telling you is that the actual numbers when we went out and got bids are actually higher than what Sonoma County reported in 2005 for a complete abatement of the soil remediation. Remove, replace, so on and so forth. So if those cost estimates are realistic, and I believe they're realistic because I sent my staff out to actually get hard cost estimates, an abatement of 20 acres could cost the county somewhere between $300,000 and $1.7 million on a 20-acre parcel. Now, do I know if there's 20 acres of something out there that we'll have to do this on? I do not know that. I have no clue. There could be none of this. So it could cost the county nothing. It could be 10 acres, could be 40 acres. I mean, I don't know. there's probably some people here that do know where there's some of this at and probably could put the numbers to it. Under the same 20-acre assumption for abatement, the real market value for 20 acres, as I said, at 500 an acre or 1,000 an acre would be somewhere between 10 and 20,000. So even in the best case scenario of using RR5, the value would be 400,000. That is, even if we could lien and even if we can make it a personal obligation, and I told you already we can't lien and pursue it as a property tax process according to our solid waste ordinance, we can make it a personal obligation, but you see the deficit. The difference becomes a county obligation because we will have done everything we could to recover the costs we could if we chose to pursue an abatement that required this process. So those are pretty big numbers in probably a worst case scenario. Pushing up near $2 million on a 20-acre abatement. The whole code enforcement budget right now is $538,000. So it wouldn't take very many of those before we would be in a fairly tough situation if the Board of Commissioners chose to pursue that as an enforcement and abatement, which the ordinance does provide for. Let's see. I'm going to repeat this again. It's not intended to promote approval or rejection of the GMO measure. I'm not urging voters to vote in any particular manner. It was reviewed by the Secretary of State's office for compliance. And I'll stop there. Before I actually answer questions, I do want to reiterate that I'm not guaranteeing any of this information that I said here. There is a lot in that definition that nor my staff comprehend or understand what the potential impacts, or I'll use the term unintended consequences, could have been. I think it's fairly clear what the intended purpose of the ordinance is. There's a lot of language in here that results in other actions that are necessarily costly to the county to implement. So, you have any questions?
Before I ask for questions, I want to remind my fellow commissioners again that on the last page and first page about this, if you want to ask questions, make sure you're not leading in one way or another for approval or disapproval of the ordinance itself. It's just on the facts, on the cost. So just to remind you of that in your questions. And with that,
Well, Mr. Chair, I want to say, Danny, I sure appreciate all this information. This is the sort of information we requested for you to produce. Very helpful, hopefully be helpful for the public. And I understand that your PowerPoint presentation would be available through a public records request at the Commissioner's office if the public wanted access to it.
It is a public record now that it's been presented publicly.
Okay.
Thank you. Danny, has staff given any consideration, because we look at these numbers, has staff given any consideration to where the money would come from to be able to do this? What programs would have to be cut to be able to create this new program? I was just wondering if any consideration.
Let me
was
say
given
this.
there.
There's no other means of funding besides general fund for this, unless there's some grants that I am not unaware of. I'm not aware of any grants that would support this kind of activity. Maybe there is. Maybe there's private foundations that would support it. Maybe there's groups of people that support the ordinance that would like to see the county enforce it so they're able to raise money. I mean, there are options. But if the county were to fund it, it's a general fund expenditure. In fact, one of my conversations with Mr. Combs was that his belief was the county would, which was not represented in my presentation because it's an indirect cost, not a hard cost, but the county would save money through our weed abatement program because once these genetically modified plants are removed, weeds would become less resistant to the types of applications we make to kill and manage weeds. And that may be true. I don't know if it's true or not. If it is true, that's a road fund expenditure, and road funds are dedicated. That would not help support the cost to the general fund of funding this program. Those are two totally different funding streams with a lot of different rules and how they're going. The ordinance does call for that so let me do clear this so that this is specific. The ordinance does say that the community development director can direct the abatement using county equipment. The county does not have equipment available for this type of abatement. And people will say, what do you mean? You got dump trucks and front end loaders and you got everything that you need. We do. However, it's illegal for us to use those in the road department for a non-road department function unless they're paid for. So it would be the same cost to us whether we contracted or use our own equipment. And that's because the road fund is funded by dedicated funding, which is a gas tax, and it has to be used for the purpose of developing and maintaining roads. It can't be used for some, we've had the same conversation with the sheriff when he's doing marijuana eradication. Why can't I use the road truck, dump trucks to, we can't because it's illegal. So it gets complex when you start talking about how to fund it. I will tell you it's a discretionary decision. It's up to the board. With discretionary immunity, it's up to you whether you even choose to implement and enforce. There are provisions in the ordinance that allow people to personally seek a remedy. And that's notwithstanding any arguments that the ordinance may or may not be legal, both at the state or federal level. So there's a whole lot of stuff that has to go on there, not considerations in the cost estimate that I'm providing you. So there are other means, Commissioner Bridenthal, and besides that, I really do think it's a policy decision, and I'm not comfortable speaking to that because I don't think that's my role.
I understand.
Well,
Yeah, I do have one more. And Danny, I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but we do have quite a few absentee landowners here in the valley. Let's assume somebody owns 5 acres here, but they live in Utah, and they lease it to someone here, and so they don't know what's being grown on it. Where do you think the responsibility for a abatement would go, to the landowner or the leasee?
Well, I mean, the ordinance qualifies that if it's unknowingly or unwillingly, and if the landowner unknowing and unwillingly had this violation occur on their property, the ordinance pretty makes it clear that they wouldn't be accountable for it. What it attempts to make clear, but doesn't necessarily, is that we could make it a personal obligation of the offender
I see.
if they knowingly and willingly did it. However, in talking with legal counsel, there are some challenges to that, and I really don't want to get into it because if I begin discussing that, I believe it's going off of the issue of cost rather than
Sure.
promoting or opposing the measure, and I really want to avoid doing that.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
One last.
Go ahead.
I know when we did a lot of work on fires and stuff, we'd have to worry about Port Orford cedar, root rot, and stuff like that from one watershed to another watershed, and we had to set up special wash stations to contain that contaminant. Were your cost estimates here on the cleanup of the abatement portion per acre, did that include the washing and cleaning of the equipment afterwards, or would that be an additional, or would that be part of the contract?
Well, I mean, let me be real frank about this. These numbers, as I said, are meant to be a range for your consideration.
Yeah.
They could be no cost all the way up to a couple $1 million an acre in terms of remediation. The issue is that I don't have the expertise to answer that question for you, and neither do anyone on our staff. However, we would certainly consult with an individual consultant who is an expert in it, and we would likely believe that they would specify to us all of the steps we would need to take to minimize contamination. I spoke to some of those and the cost of some of those. That's why I'm telling you, I would not consider these costs all-inclusive or not inclusive. I mean, as I said, they could range from $0 because there is the ability for a private citizen to take personal action. I mean, the ordinance does set it's a county ordinance.
Yeah.
So typically the county doesn't have an ordinance that we don't enforce. Now, it may have portions of our ordinance that aren't enforceable, but that's different than we don't enforce. When they're not enforceable because of a law change, then state law prevails. But when we have ordinances, we typically have them because we enforce them. So, we would go through those processes and really until we actually get a case, then I don't know. I mean, how do you minimize contamination if you're removing carnations from Home Depot? I mean, I don't know. I don't know that you have to do anything. I don't even know that it can contaminate something. So it's hard for me to give you a cost estimate until we actually have someone present us with a case. And, so I tried to give you the variance of what the impacts could be. And I'm fairly comfortable in that because I did talk to someone who's an expert who kind of essentially verified, here's kind of the full range of this, and it's broad. So those things I'm sure are probably considerations. I mean, seeds travel by air, they travel by water. If this is a Jackson County ordinance, we have counties all around us that don't have this ordinance, so seeds travel by air. They could travel by truck. They can, get on the tire of a truck that's driving across the field. There's all of those questions about, the ordinance speaks to minimizing contamination. So how far do you take that? And that's where I tried to say, trying to be credible here in how far you take it. I mean, we're not going to probably go out and build a dome over something and enclose it, and so trying to be reasonable as I can in providing you a cost estimate under certain assumptions. Those may not be reasonable assumptions to someone who actually is an expert. They may say, hey, if you're going to minimize contamination, you need to set up this kind of barrier for entry into waterways and this kind of barrier and this kind of traffic route. And they may say none of that. I mean, I just don't know, Commissioner Bridenthal. So
I was curious.
Thank you for the research. Thank your staff and such. I mean, obviously, you've given us some pretty big numbers, and as normal human beings, we're going to fixate on those large numbers. I would caution that we would look at, we'd consider, as you've stated several times, the broad range, the what-ifs and et cetera that go along with that, the assumptions. So with that, again, thank you for your work, and you've done what we asked you to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been asked earlier if this was a public hearing or where the public would have an opportunity to either respond in kind or such, and this is not. This was a presentation for your board by our administrator. For those who want to contact any commissioner individually, certainly feel free to. If you have questions or rebuttals or whatever the case may be, please take advantage of that opportunity if you so wish. With that, we're going to move on the agenda. Gee, we got some people staying. Okay. All right. The next item on the agenda is a request for discussion for non-agenda items. Pursuant to the codified ordinances of Jackson County, Section 213.06, members of the public may address any item that is not on the agenda. So is there anyone here this morning that wishes to speak to anything that is not on the agenda? If so, please come forward, state your name and your address for the record. Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, 20.00. It's our consent calendar. There are some things underneath that umbrella, such as minutes of meetings of Board of Commissioners work session January 21, 2014, and February 18 and 25 of 2014. Board of Commissioners regular meeting February 12 and 19 of 2014. Board of Commissioners staff meeting January 16 and 30 of 2014. I'm going to stop right there because I'm going to go, these next two we're going to do individually. So I'm looking for a motion on that portion, 20.01.
Mr. Chair, I move we approve the minutes referenced in 20.
Second.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Bridenfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Yes, thank you. The next one's a proclamation. It's 20.02. It's an order proclaiming April as Southern Oregon in the 1960s month. I remember those. That's our order number 35-14. I'm going to read that proclamation before I ask for and the proclamation says, whereas the Southern Oregon Historical Society, Criterion Theater, and all Jackson County Library branches, Girl Scouts, 4-H, Eagle Point High School, Multicultural Club, Master Gardeners, Master Food Preservers, Medford Railroad Park, local historical societies, and other organizations are partnering for a county-wide Southern Oregon in the 1960s event for the month of April 2014. And whereas the event will feature artifacts, photographs, and stories throughout Jackson County highlighting the civil rights, environmental, science, popular culture, and youth movements that changed the face of our nation and our region during this era. And whereas Southern Oregon in the 1960s includes exhibits, films, series, books, displays, poetry readings, a car show, a cruise night, and costume party, all from the 60s, and the 1960s themed Pear Blossom Parade entries are among the county-wide activities and events being planned. And whereas the event offers an opportunity to promote Jackson County and its resources on both statewide and regional basis, creating multiple possibilities for showcasing the county and enhancing the local economy. Therefore, the Board of Commissioners, the Board of County Commissioners of Jackson County hereby proclaims the month of April 2014 to be Southern Oregon in the 1960s month throughout Jackson County in recognition of an era that transformed our history and culture.
Mr. Chair, I just might comment, when we reviewed this in the staff meeting, Mr. Bragg, who's our senior deputy county administrator, was slightly offended that something would be considered a classic from the 1960s. And he was mostly referencing himself.
Where's Harvey at? He's younger than I am. How can he be complaining about that?
Oh,
They just left, sure, okay, that's the reason. Okay, I'd like to take 202 individually, so do I have a motion on that, please?
oh, you're from the era. I'm going to let you make the motion.
Mr. Chair, I move we approve the item on the consent calendar 20.02, proclaiming April of Southern Oregon in the 60s month.
Second.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Breidenfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Yes, thank you. And finally, under the consent calendar, I'd like to do this because I like to recognize folks that volunteer for these things. It's 20.03. It's an order appointing Cynthia Biles, Harlan Bittner, and Victoria Brown, and reappointing Edgar He and Donald Lockridge to the Jackson County Bicycle Committee. It's order number 3614.
Mr. Chair, I move that we adopt the final item on our consent calendar under 20.03.
Second.
Commissioner Breidenfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Yes. And again, thank you to those particular individuals and all the others that volunteer for so many of our committees. The next on the agenda is public hearings. There is none this morning. Move to discussion and deliberation under 40.00. We have 5 items there. The first one being 40.01. It's an order authorizing an intergovernmental agreement with the White City Lighting District, order number 3714. Danny?
Mr. Chair, I forgot we have to do this on both
Yeah, we do
ends.
on both sides.
So you previously addressed this as the White City Lighting District Board. Now you're addressing it as the Jackson County Board of Commissioners, and I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot of times today. But in this case, the White City Lighting District is a limited purpose county service district organized pursuant to ORS Chapter 451 to provide lighting services. Jackson County and the district have established service goals focused on identification, completion of light maintenance, repair, replacement, and capital lighting projects for the district. County's provided these employees and services to the district for which the district has reimbursed the county in an agreed-upon amount representing the value of services rendered, including but not limited to the district board's administrative functions, tax assessment and collection, workers' compensation, legal records management, mail services, street lighting maintenance, lighting capital improvements, and administrative services related to the district's meeting agendas and recordation of documents. The agreement is for the provision of all such named services within the geographic area that constitutes the organized limits of the district to provide clarity for the method of provision of those services and payment thereof. County and the district are authorized to enter into such agreements pursuant to ORS Chapter 190. Term of the agreements upon final signature through termination, and as I explained in those meetings, which I'll also explain since this is a different meeting, the Board of Commissioners serves as the board for the Lighting District and as the Board of Commissioners for Jackson County. Previously, we haven't entered into an agreement between those two bodies because the governing bodies are the same, and we thought it would be highly unlikely that you would have a conflict with each other as the same board. But County Council has advised that it legally, procedurally, it would be mitigate risk for the county to have and for the lighting district to have this agreement, and therefore, in this case, $300,000 estimated annual revenue to the county for performing these services, and I do recommend your approval.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
No questions?
None. Mr. Chair, I move we adopt order number 37-14.
Second.
Commissioner Breidenfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Yes, thank you. Redundancy prevails here. 40.02, an order authorizing an intergovernmental agreement with the White City Enhanced Law Enforcement District, order number 3814. Again, Danny.
Yeah. I should have recorded myself
FaceTime.
earlier.
Think of it as FaceTime.
I need more of that.
Yeah.
In this case, White City Enhanced Law Enforcement District is limited purpose county service district organized pursuant to Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 451 as well. In this case, however, to provide enhanced law enforcement services, Jackson County and the district have established service goals focused on identification and completion of enhanced law enforcement services and law enforcement projects in the district. County staff has been providing code enforcement as well. The county has provided employees and services to the district for which the district has reimbursed the county in an agreed upon amount representing the value of those services rendered, including but not limited to, similar as the last item, the board's administrative functions, tax assessment and collections, workers' compensation, legal records management, mail services, street enhanced law enforcement maintenance, enhanced law enforcement capital improvements, and administrative services related to the district's public meeting agendas and recordation of documents. This agreement is for provision of all such named services within the geographic area that constitutes the organized limits of the district to provide clarity for the method of provision of those services and payment thereof. County and the district are authorizing to enter into such agreements under ORS Chapter 190, term of the agreements upon final signature through termination. Estimated annual revenue of $1,300,000 for the same reason I repeated previously, and I do recommend your approval.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I move we approve Order 38-14.
Second.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Breinfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Sundry?
Yes. The next item is 40.03. It's an order authorizing a permit and right of entry with EAM Incorporated doing business as Southern Oregon Rentals. It's our order number 3914.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, in this case, EAM is a car rental company. They desire a permit and right of entry for access to the Rogue Valley International Medford Airport as an off-airport rental car business. Pursuant to Jackson County Codified Ordinances 238.01 through 238.99, a permit is required for off-airport rental car, parking lot, and flight kitchen operators who are granted the privilege of accessing airport customers and thereby utilizing airport facilities. Term of the permit is upon final signature and shall continue until terminated. It's an undetermined revenue. However, EAM will pay a monthly privilege fee of 10% of its gross airport receipts upon execution of this permit. That's the same percentage that the on-field providers pay, and I do recommend your approval.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
No questions?
No questions. Mr. Chair, I move we adopt order number 39-14.
Second?
Commissioner Breinfeld?
Yes.
Commissioner Rasher?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Thank you. Next is 40.04. It's an order authorizing construction contract number 258 with LTM Incorporated, doing business as Knife River Materials. It's our order number 40-14.
Mr. Chair, in this case, Jackson County is acting to improve and widen Table Rock Road from Wilson Road to Elmhurst Street and realign the East Gregory Road intersection. Advertisements for competitive bids were published in the January 24th and 26th, 2014 editions of the Medford Mail Tribune and the January 24th, 2014 edition of the Daily Journal of Commerce. Notices were also placed on BidNet and the Jackson County website. Contact documents were sent to 25 contractors, and we received 7 bids. The bids are as follows. LTM Incorporating, doing business as Knife River, bid $2,768,410. Copeland Paving Incorporated bid $2,929,619. Cogap Enterprises Incorporated bid $2,979,967. HGC Incorporated bid $3,011,093. Leduc Construction LLC bid $3,025,922. Oregon Mainline Paving LLC bid $3,102,954. And Carter & Company Incorporated bid $3,284,593. It's a great environment for bidding these types of projects. Our engineer's estimate was $3,191,886. LTM, doing business as Knife River Materials, did submit the lowest bid at $2,768,410 and should be awarded the contract. The term of the contract is March 12th of 2014 through October 31st of 2014. It is a financial impact of $2,768,410. It is budgeted as part of the road fund. It is a project that you've approved for the road department, and I do recommend your approval.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
Mr. Chair, I have a question, and you could probably answer it. If you couldn't, I know John Vile could. I see that the East Gregory Bridge is in place now, and it was a separate contract for this?
It was what? John Vile, our Road and Parks Director.
Mr. Chair, the East Gregory Bridge was an internally built bridge. We built that with our own forces, and we built that ahead of the project. The contractor is basically going to build the road butting up to the bridge that we constructed ahead of time.
I do think we had an individual contract for footings, didn't we?
We did. We had a couple of contracts. We bought beams for it from an independent contractor, and we had somebody come in and assist with the foundation work.
And that was our own crews that mainly built that bridge?
Our crews built the forms
Oh,
for
yeah.
the abutments, and they set the beams. Yes.
Good job, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
See it every day.
Before you leave, John, there's going to be some traffic implications on that. Why don't you, for the traveling public, why don't you just share that, please?
One of the, I guess, good sides of the drought that we're having is we have some very favorable weather to start construction. Knife River has indicated they want to start construction as soon as this contract's approved, and so we should see construction on that start in the next couple of weeks. 2 lanes of travel will be maintained on Table Rock Road throughout the life of the project, but there will be flaggers, there will be some intermittent delays. If you can find alternative routes, we would encourage you to do so, but Table Rock Road will be open the whole time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Did we move on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Okay.
Mr. Chair, move we approve order 40-14.
Second.
Commissioner Masher?
Yes.
Commissioner Reinfeldt?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Thank you. The last item on our agenda this morning is 40.05. It's an order authorizing this assignment and assumption and consent agreement with a Naturally Resourceful Consulting LLC. It's our order number 41-14. Interesting name. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, in this case, Jackson County has a current personal services contract with Paige Pruitt set up as a sole proprietorship to help the county meet portions of the Opportunity to Recycle program goals. This is required, not the contract with Paige, but the program goals are required under Oregon Revised Statute 459A, providing citizens and businesses education on waste reduction and opportunities to recycle and to manage the Jackson County SmartWorks program in this case. Ms. Pruitt, as the SmartWorks program director, plans, promotes, and organizes master recycler volunteers and plastic roundup, county e-cycle event, county surplus sales, and provides recycling opportunities for various community events. In December of 2013, Ms. Pruitt registered the business Naturally Resourceful Consulting LLC with the Oregon Secretary of State for the sole purpose of providing the same business services through that LLC as she was providing as a sole proprietor. The assignment reflects change from a sole proprietorship to a limited liability company. Mr. Chair, I will tell you that there's only 6 months left on this contract. The term of the contract is January 1st, 2014 through June 30th of 2014, I guess. 3 months left on the contract, and requires ratification to become effective January 1st, 2014. We also have provided notice of termination following the end of this contract, and we're working with our recyclers, or our garbage handlers, to take on the duties specified in the program. So we will not be seeking to renew the contract at the end of this term.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, go ahead.
I have my typical question. Danny, why does this come to the board since there's no financial impact in such a short period?
It comes to the board. I don't have the amount of the contract, but I believe the contract exceeds 30,000. The original contract exceeds
Good numbers
30,000.
for 6 months.
Okay, all right. Well, it says there's no financial impact.
Well, it doesn't change the original contract.
see.
This is just
Yeah.
changing the name. The original contract was more than 30,000, so it's required to come to the board if it's more than 30,000 or more than a year. In this case, it was just a year, but it was more than 30,000. So the name change is required to come to the board based on the amount of the contract.
Okay, that explains it. Thank you.
Simple name change. Mr. Chair, I move
Government work.
we adopt order number 41-14.
Second?
Commissioner Reinfeldt?
Yes.
Commissioner Masher?
Yes.
Commissioner Skundrick?
Yes, thank you. That concludes the business before your Board of Commissioners this morning on the 14th of, here on the 12th, rather, of March. Thank you for those in attendance. It was a rather interesting, I think, morning, and enjoy your day. This meeting is adjourned.